the House, but I did the Senate just based on time.
Sure. Okay. And just to take a step back, generally when you use Maptitude to draw maps, is it largely a manual process?
Yes, I have to go through and pick blocks. There are ways to pick a whole city or a whole census tract or a whole block route, but that's just kind of a manual shortcut that speeds up the clicking process a little bit. But it really is a examination of the map, area by area, block by block in the end.
And did you apply your Republican advantage score to evaluate the partisan balance of your test map?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe the results of that analysis appear on this demonstrative. Can you describe those for the court?
Correct. So as shown at the bottom of the demonstrative, you see that in the enacted map, there were 18 safe Democratic seats, as we talked about. I was able to flip 4 of those all the way out of the safe Democratic category and into safe Republican. And I was also able to flip the 12 seats that were in that competitive range. All of them moved into the safe Republican range. So we ended up with only 14 safe Democratic seats, 0 competitive seats, and 36 safe Republican seats.
All right. How would you visually describe this test map compared to the enacted 2017 Senate map?
There's a famous saying out of California in the 80s where the guy who drew the map referred to it as his contribution. His name was Phil Burton. He referred to it as his contribution to modern art, and this would probably fall into that category. These are not lines that follow counties or compactness or anything like that. They go where they need to go to achieve the purpose.
Okay. Dr. Johnson, in your studies of North Carolina, did you encounter an example from North Carolina history of a Senate plan that had a similar look to your maximum Republican test map?
Yes, the 2001 Senate map that was adopted in 2001, notably when Democrats were in control, looks very similar to this map.
Okay, and I'd like for you now to turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 76. And is this the 2001 adopted Senate map?
Yes.
Now, were any general elections ever conducted under this 2001 Senate plan?
No.
Okay, and why not?
This is the redistricting that led to the Stevenson litigation and the court decision that the county groupings rule was required.
Okay. Dr. Johnson, did you analyze how many counties were split between the 3 plans that we looked at, the enacted 2017, the enacted 2001, and then your test plan?
Yes.
I'd like for you now to turn to Demonstrative Johnson 3. Okay. How many counties did these 3 maps split?
So the 2017 enacted map was the best at 12 counties split. My maximum Republican test split 64, and the 2001 Senate map split 51.
Dr. Johnson, did you look at any groupings, county groupings, in addition to simply the statewide Senate plan?
Yes.
Okay. Did you look at the Mecklenburg Senate grouping in particular?
Yes.
Okay. And why did you pick the Mecklenburg Senate grouping to study?
It's one county, so it's fairly easy to look at. Within the county groupings rule, it contains all of its districts entirely within that one county. And it has a large share of the Senate districts that are subject to change. that can be drawn without being locked in by by the county groupings rule.
All right, so I'd like for now to have you turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 74. When you get there. Dr. Johnson, I believe this is figure 3 from your report, correct?
Yes.
All right. And what are we looking at here?
This is the 2017 adopted Senate districts for Mecklenburg County.
All right. Okay. And did you calculate, using your Republican advantage, scoring the partisan balance for the Mecklenburg Senate grouping under the enacted plan?
Yes.
And what did you conclude about the partisan balance of the 5 districts contained within the Mecklenburg Senate grouping?
As adopted, the map has 3 safe Democratic seats, 1 safe Republican seat, and 1 competitive seat.
All right. Okay. I'd like for you now to turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 75. That's good. All right. Can you describe for the court what this, and this is figure 4 from your report. Dr. Johnson, can you describe for the court what this figure depicts?
Yes, so this is zooming in on the Mecklenburg County portion of my statewide Senate Republican Advantage test map.
All right. And how many districts were you able to draw in Mecklenburg County in this test map?
Well, since in the test map I'm not following the county groupings rule, there are actually 9 districts that come into Mecklenburg County, only one of which is entirely within the county.
All right. And did you use your Republican advantage scoring to evaluate the partisan balance of the 9 districts in Mecklenburg County under your test map?
Yes.
All right. I understand your testimony is under the enacted plan. You came up with 3 safe Democratic seats, 1 safe Republican seat, and 1 competitive seat in the enacted Senate plan. What were the results of your evaluation of the partisan balance of this maximum Republican test map?
Well, once I didn't have the county groupings rule limiting it, I was able to pull in the Republican voters from the surrounding counties and blend them in with 8 of the 9 districts. So the result is we get 1 safe Democratic seat instead of 3. We're down from 3 to 1. And the 8 other seats that touch the county are all safe Republican. So we end up with 8 safe Republican and 1 safe Democrat.
And Dr. Johnson, did you also study the Senate grouping containing New Hanover County?
Yes.
All right, so I'd like to now pull up Legislative Defendants Exhibit 81. Which is figure 10 to your report. Dr. Johnson, do you recognize this as the county grouping that includes New Hanover County?
Yes.
All right, can you explain to the court what's going on in this figure?
So these are in a county grouping, the 4 counties shown, Bladen, Pender, Brunswick, and New Hanover. And they have the population for 2 Senate districts. New Hanover is almost the right size for 1 district, but it's just a little bit off from what would enable the New Hanover to be a district on its own and the other 3 to be a district on their own.
So does that mean that population had to be moved out of New Hanover County to balance population?
Exactly. They could qualify as the county grouping rule of these 4 counties could have 2 districts in them, but New Hanover couldn't quite qualify under the traversal rule to be a district on its own, just purely because of total population counts. We're too far off.
Okay. And I'd like to zoom into the spot where District 8 crosses the line into New Hanover County. Do that. All right. Dr. Johnson, I'll represent you. There's been a lot of discussion in other testimony about this particular portion of New Hanover County. It's been described as a squiggle, a notch, many different terms. Do you see that on the screen?
Yes.
All right. Approximately how many people were moved from District 9 to District 8 through this squiggle?
About 5,000.
All right. Did the 2017 plan, which I believe is what's on the screen, move more people than was necessary to balance population?
No, it was essentially just, maybe you could have done 10 or 20 more one way or the other, but it was essentially just the population needed to balance the two districts.
Now, do you recall if a Republican or a Democrat won District 9 in the 2018 general election?
Democrat won District 9 by about 200 votes. It's a very close race.
Now, Dr. Johnson, were you able to draw a version of this county grouping that would have a more favorable Republican partisan balance than the enacted 2017 plan?
Yes.
All right, I'd like to now turn to Exhibit 82. Dr. Johnson, I'll represent this as Figure 11 from your report. Can you walk the court through this figure and how it's different from the enacted New Hanover grouping?
Sure. So in this map, we're still within the 4-county grouping, but instead of just taking the squiggle, as we call it, for New Hanover, in this case, District 8 takes much more of New Hanover County. Essentially, the southwestern edge of the whole county moves in. That's picking up more population, so now District 9 is short, and so District 9 moves north and picks up territory that's a bit friendlier to Republicans. So it increases the Republican advantage score of District 9 by about 2.5% or so. Of course, that 2.5% would be far more than the 200 vote margin in 2018, so this change would have kept that seat in all likelihood in Republican hands.
Okay. And just for clarity, when you talk about the Republican advantage, is that displayed on the screen, the Republican advantage score?
Yes, so the labels on each district, the top number is the district number, and the bottom number is the Republican advantage score.
Okay. Does this particular configuration you drew, does that configuration comply with North Carolina's traversal rule?
No, it does not. So it stays within the county grouping, but it does not follow the state's traversal rule, which would say that I believe it's Pender County to the north of New Hanover. Yes. So the traversal rule would say that Pender County has to be together. So this test map is staying within the county grouping, but not following the traversal piece of that law.
Okay. Now, what do these examples that we've gone through show us about the effect of the county grouping rules on map maker discretion to draw for partisan gain?
They show that the county grouping and traversal rule puts a very significant limit on what the legislature and their map drawers can do in terms of having the flexibility to draw for partisan advantage or other similar instincts. By keeping the lines within very contained areas, it really limits the extent to which you can draw the lines to achieve some goal like partisan advantage.
And practically speaking, if when a map maker is attempting to achieve some partisan balance in a plan, would it be normal for such a map maker to, try to go outside and try to pull population from other counties?
Yes, definitely. If you look at Maryland, if you look at Illinois, look at Wisconsin, there are examples across the country of maps that look a lot like the 2001 map and a lot like my test map, where exactly those types of districts have been drawn. And I should note, by both parties. So, Wisconsin was Republicans, Maryland was Democrats, so both parties do it when they have control of the line drawing.
Now, Dr. Johnson, did you look at whether the enacted 2017 plans maximized Republican political advantage even within the framework of the county grouping rules?
Yes.
And to be clear, although you looked at it with respect to the county grouping rules, you didn't analyze the cumulative effect of all traditional criteria on map maker discretion, correct?
Right. I looked at it in sample groups. I didn't look at it statewide as a total.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to now pull up demonstrative Johnson 4. And I'll represent this as a demonstrative that captures figure 7 and figure 6 and figure 7 from your report, which are legislative defendants exhibits 77 and 78. Dr. Johnson, what are these two figures showing us?
So the map on the left is, as we've seen before, the Mecklenburg adopted map from 2017, but now it's labeled with each district's district number and Republican advantage score. So for example, the yellow district at the top is District 41, and its Republican advantage score is 6.9%, putting it in the competitive range. Then on the right, we have a new test where I was working within the county grouping and traversal rule, so working just in Mecklenburg County, to see if a map with a stronger Republican advantage could be drawn.
Okay, so you drew, and to be clear, the map that you drew on the right, figure 7, that was separate from the whole state test map that you drew that we discussed earlier.
Correct. This is an entirely different test because now I'm staying within the county grouping.
Okay. And what were you able to achieve with the test map figure 7?
So with the changes indicated with the little arrows, essentially I ignored the VTDs, ignored trying to keep together the VTDs, I ignored trying to keep legislators in their own districts, ignored concern with the city borders, all those other considerations that were discussed in the adopted map, and just went for Republican advantage within this county. And you can see District 41 up north is now 18.3%, so it's moved into the safe Republican category. District 39 at the south is 15.2, so it remains safe Republican, and the other three districts are even safer Democratic seats.
Okay, and if we could zoom back out to the full demonstrative. Dr. Johnson, at the bottom, you ran some calculations for the partisan balance, compactness, and the number of VTD splits. Could you walk the court through those?
Sure. So the first line just shows, I was just walking through where the change in the maps was able to move the competitive seat into the safe Republican seat. Then I also looked at the Polsby-Popper and REOC scores for the two maps, and this reflects something that happens all the time with the mathematical measures of compactness, which is, even though I wasn't looking compactness, the Polsby-Popper score on the test map is actually better. It goes up from 0.28 in the adopted map to 0.31 by Polsby-Popper, while at the same time by the REOC, R-E-O-C-K measure, that goes down from 0.37 to 0.34. And this just shows really why there's a lot of debate about compactness measures. You get results all over the place with all of them, depending on which measures you're using, which is why, certainly in our work in Arizona that I did and in other places, compactness measures are useful as a floor. They're not nearly as useful as an absolute measure or looking at averages or that kind of thing. The example I always say is, do we really care if you're 0.85, you're almost a perfect circle, versus 0.9, which is essentially a perfect circle? No. What we really care about compactness measures is the ugly ones. And so, and this change kind of shows how, even though I would certainly describe the map on the right, my test map is uglier looking, it actually got a better Polsby-Popper score. And then the last row is the VTD splits, and talked about, in my test, I ignored VTD splits. And you can see it goes from 1 VTD split in the enacted map to 11 split in the test map. One thing I should clarify, there was some inartful wording in my report. So there were 2 different numbers given. I talk about 1 and 2 and 11 and 15. In the enacted map, there's 1 VTD split into 2 pieces. And in the test map, there's 11 VTD split into 15 pieces. So that's where the 2 and 15 come from. It's the number of pieces of VTDs as opposed to the number of VTDs themselves that are divided. But obviously, I was able to achieve an additional safe Republican seat by ignoring things like trying to follow VTDs and trying to follow the city border and those kinds of things.
Sure. All right. Now, Dr. Johnson, in your supplemental report, you performed some further analysis on this Senate grouping. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Let's turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 85. Okay. And Dr. Johnson, this is supplemental figure 1. Well, figure 1 from your supplemental report, excuse me. What does this figure depict?
So this map, we're back to the adopted Senate map for Mecklenburg County. And again, it's showing with the thick blue lines and the labels, the districts that were adopted by the legislature for the Senate in Meck County. And again, the labels are the district number and the Republican advantage score. The shading in this case, the pink that we see there, those are the official incorporated borders of Charlotte. And then the thin black lines are the VTD boundaries.
Okay. And Dr. Johnson, what does this image help show about or help inform the configuration of District 41?
So it really highlights how District 41 is drawn to capture as much of the suburban northern part of Mecklenburg County and east and western edge of Mecklenburg County as possible. So really what the districts are doing is following the city border as much as you can when following VTD lines. So Charlotte, as cities all over the state and all over the country, has a funny looking border. You can see the zigs and zags in the pink area. So the map doesn't follow the city border exactly, but it follows the city border as well as you can when following VTDs. So we get the non-city north end of the county, the suburban north end of the county, the suburban west edge, and then down in the southwest, you get more city territory just as it picks up the rest of the population it needs to get the population count. But it stays out of the core of Charlotte, which is really in 37, 38, and 40. So those 3 districts are entirely in Charlotte, except for some jigs and jags in the edge. All the VTDs that are in them are mainly city VTDs. And then down at the end, you get District 39, which gets the rest of the city, and then the southeastern suburban areas. So really, the adopted map, when looked at in this way, is pretty clearly 1 suburban district, 3 city districts, and then District 39 combines the rest of the city and the rest of the suburban area.
Now, Dr. Johnson, did you review an alternative to the 2017 enacted plan proposed by Senator Jeff Jackson?
Yes.
All right. I'd like for you to now turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 86. 86.
Okay.
All right. And this is supplemental figure 2 from your supplemental report, excuse me. And do you understand this to be Senator Jeff Jackson's proposed Amendment 4 to Senate Bill 691?
Yes.
And what would you describe as the differences between the enacted 2017 plan and this proposed amendment?
So this map kind of, we call it pinwheels the city. Some people refer to it as pies up the city, where it slices the city amongst all of the districts. So instead of having 3 very focused Charlotte districts and a 4th seat that is part Charlotte, part suburban, and then a suburban seat, this map slices up the city and puts all the pieces of the city with suburban areas, kind of ignores the 2 different community differences. And it ends up being a bit more compact, and it also has the advantage from a Democratic legislator's perspective of having now 4 safe Democratic seats, and 1 down at the bottom, District 39, is 10.2% Republican, so just barely in my safe Republican range. So this takes the competitive seat and moves it in the Democratic column, while also eliminating any differentiation between suburban and city territory amongst the districts.
Okay. I'd like for you now to turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 87. I'll represent that this is, I think on your supplemental report, Dr. Johnson, I think you actually ended up with 2 figure 1s. So we've, although this says figure 1, we'll refer to it as figure 3. What does this figure depict?
So this is also showing Mecklenburg County and the Republican advantage scores census block by census block. So the purples, blues, and greens are in the negative range, so they would be the leaning to safe Democratic areas, and the yellows, oranges, and reds are 0 to over 31%. So those would be the lean and safe Republican census blocks.
So it appears in the southern portion of Charlotte, you have some pretty significant red area. Is that correct?
Yes.
So fair to say a fair amount of Republican support in that portion of Charlotte?
Definitely.
Okay. All right. And did you compete? Well, let me have you turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 88. And this is Table 1 from your supplemental report, Dr. Jackson. What, and I believe what you're doing here is looking at how the shift between the adopted map and Senator Jackson's proposal. Is that right?
Correct.
And what do you conclude about the shift in the partisan balance of the Mecklenburg Senate grouping between the adopted map and Senator Jackson's map?
Well, you can clearly see at the bottom in District 41, we go from a 6.9% Republican advantage to a negative 11.3, which would make it a safe Democratic seat. District 39 drops from a 22.8% Republican advantage down to 10.2%, while the 3 seats that are in the adopted map are the safe Democratic seats stay in the safe Democratic column.
Was this an example of where, even improving on the compactness of a districting plan can have a predictable partisan effect.
Exactly. It comes out with a higher compactness scores, but at the cost of ignoring the difference between suburban and city communities' interests, and then with the entirely predictable partisan results that I'm sure Senator Jackson was aware of, as all legislators, I'm sure, are aware of the partisan results of the maps that they're evaluating once they look at the details.
Your Honor, I'll object to that. Move to strike. As all legislators are aware, there's no foundation laid for that.
Sustained as to speculation.
Dr. Johnson, we've been talking a lot about the Senate this afternoon. Did you study any of the specific House groupings
Yes.
in this case? Okay. I believe you studied Wake County, is that correct?
Yes.
So I'd like to have you now turn to Legislative Defendants Exhibit 79. I'll represent to you, this is Figure 8 from your report. These are these the 2017 enacted House districts for Wake County?
Correct.
All right. How many House districts are contained in this particular county?
There are 11 House districts in the county.
Okay. Did you assess the partisan balance of the districts under the enacted plan using the Republican Advantage Index we've been discussing?
Yes, the numbers shown on the map are, again, the top number is the district number, and then the bottom number is the Republican Advantage score. So positive number over 10 would be a safe Republican, positive number below -10 would be a safe Democratic, and so on.
Okay. All right. So I now would like to have you turn to what we've marked as Johnson Demonstrative 5. And I'll represent that on the left. On this, we have Figure 8 from your report, which is Legislative Defendants Exhibit 79. And on the right, we have Figure 9 from your report, which is Legislative Defendants Exhibit 80. Now, Dr. Johnson, did you create a test map to try to maximize for Republican advantage within the Wake County group?
Yes.
And does the Figure 9 on this demonstrative represent the results of your work?
Yes, this again is working just within this county, so I didn't do a statewide test, but just looking within the county grouping. Again, Phil Burton's words echo through my ears of pretty good contribution to modern art. These are not at all compact districts, and I ignored things like compactness, following VTDs, trying to keep the incumbents in their own seats, and instead went purely for maximum Republican advantage within this county, and was able to switch it from being one safe Republican seat with 4 competitives and 6 safe Democratic seats to 6 safe Democratic, 2 safe Republican, and 3 competitive. So added one more, or moved 1 seat from the competitive to the safe category. And you can see at the bottom the compactness scores. In this case, they both go the same way. They both, Polsby-Popper and REAC, go down, and the VTD splits rockets up from 4 out of 191 to 36 out of 191 split VTDs. So some gain, added another safe Republican seat, but took some very creative drawing
To get there. Okay. And this particular your test alternative complies with the county grouping and traversal rules, correct?
Yes, it does.
County group, we'll do the question again. And to be clear, Dr. Johnson, this your test county grouping complies with the county grouping and traversals requirements, correct?
Yes, it does.
Now, Dr. Johnson, does your analysis in this case, including the exhibits that we've just looked at, allow you to draw a conclusion about whether the 2017 enacted plans maximize Republican advantage in the legislature?
It does. My
what-
analysis does now.
Okay. And what conclusion does that?
Oh, yes, it does. My analysis does allow me to make a conclusion about that.
Okay. And what conclusion do you draw?
That the adopted maps do not maximize Republican advantage.
Does your analysis in this case, including everything that we've looked at so far, demonstrate whether the county grouping rules are a significant limitation on the map maker's discretion when creating a district plan?
Yes, without a doubt, they are a strong restriction on the flexibility for map makers and how far they can go on drawing advantage for one party.
And in fact, in your own experience, Dr. Johnson, have you had occasion to draw statewide plans where you have to take partisan balance into account?
Yes. In Arizona, we had to follow exactly this methodology. Interestingly, with the reverse goal, the Arizona Constitution requires preference for competitive districts. So we're looking at the exact same data, using the exact same methods of moving people around and approaching the different lines. Just with, instead of shooting for X, in this case Republican advantage, in that case we're shooting for Y, which is as many competitive districts as possible.
All right. Dr. Johnson, we've heard a lot in this case about municipal and VTD splits. I'd first like to ask you, Dr. Chen in his testimony earlier in this case made the statement that it would make no sense to him for a jurisdiction to prefer to split more municipalities than it needs to. Do you agree with that statement?
Objection, Your Honor. There's nothing about any of this in any of his three reports.
Mr. Lewis?
He is being brought in to rebut testimony, among which was Dr. Chen's testimony on direct, that it split, that there would be no reason for a jurisdiction to split more municipalities than necessary. That was not a statement that was offered in his report, to my knowledge.
Your Honor, they elicited that testimony from Dr. Chen on cross. You can't elicit testimony on cross and then bootstrap that to bring a new expert rebuttal of the testimony that you yourself elicited.
Sustained.
Dr. Johnson, can you explain what a VTD is?
Sure, it's a voting district or vote tabulation district that is created for election administration. So in North Carolina, there are some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, they are the lowest level of geography where you can get election results reported. In some cases, they're divided in North Carolina into precincts, but mainly that's the goal of VTDs, is to collect election data in a geographic layer. And they are, so essentially if you follow VTDs in redistricting, that does simplify implementation of the new map. Once it's adopted, when the election officials have to implement it, it's a lot easier if they can just assign a VTD from one district to another and it's not split. And there also is a tradition in North Carolina of respecting VTDs, much more so than in many other states. Other states often will just not worry about them and leave that to election officers to deal with afterwards.
Are VTDs in North Carolina intended to represent the borders of municipalities or other recognized communities of interest?
No, not to my knowledge.
In your study of the Wake County House grouping and the Mecklenburg and New Hanover Senate groupings in the 2017 enacted plans, did you notice any pattern to how the VTDs were divided in those plans?
Objection, Your Honor. I don't believe this is in the report pattern.
It is on paragraph 18 of the supplemental report dated May 6, 2019, which is exhibit, I believe it is 280, but I could be wrong. Oh. And I am wrong. It is 289.
I see it now, Your Honor. I withdraw the objection.
Go ahead, please.
You need the paragraph number? 18. Yep.
Yes, so as we've discussed in both the counties or in the adopted map, there are very few split VTDs. And when I checked into each one of them, in the ones I looked at, they were split in order to keep a current legislator both separate from another legislator and in a friendly district. So if it was a Republican, it was to keep them in a Republican seat. If a Democrat, to keep them in a Democratic seat.
Okay. And did the VTD splits that you examined in connection with your report, did you believe whether those VTD splits acted to increase or decrease the partisan leaning of a district?
In the adopted map?
Yes.
They did not. Essentially, because the election results are reported at the VTD level, it's really difficult to divide them in a way that would generate Republican advantage in terms of votes, because you only know how many votes each candidate got in the whole VTD. You don't know whether the people on the east side of the VTD supported one candidate, the people on the west side support another, or that kind of breakdown. So you don't really know the partisan breakdown of the people you're picking up when you split the VTD. The one exception to that would be, for example, in my test map in Mecklenburg County, where you're going through territory that you know the whole VTD is largely unfriendly, to get to another pocket of, in my case, Republican voters. So you divide the VTD to pick up as few of the voters as possible. You're not getting Republican advantage from the voters in that neck, but you're simply minimizing how many unfriendly voters you pick up in your district by dividing the VTD.
All right. Switching gears, Dr. Johnson, we've spent many hours in this trial hearing testimony about files on storage devices that plaintiffs received from Dr. Tom Hoffler's estranged daughter months after his death. And I'll represent to you that some of those files were then incorporated into a rebuttal expert report by Dr. Chen. Did you review and respond to that rebuttal expert report by Dr. Chen?
Yes.
And was that your rebuttal expert report, which I believe is Exhibit 290?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. And did you review, I'm specifically referring to, we had a fair amount of testimony during Dr. Chen's examination about a comparison between how much of certain maps recovered from these storage devices were similar to the adopted House and Senate plans in 2017. Do you recall reviewing the Maptitude backup files that Dr. Chen referenced in his report for those conclusions?
Yes.
And specifically, did you review a June 28, 2017 version of the NC House J-25003.back.zip file referenced in Dr. Chen's report?
Yes.
And did you also review the June 24, 2017 version of the NC Senate J-24001.back.zip file referenced on page 25 of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Johnson, just to orient the court, can you explain what kind of files are, strike that. Let's just go. I think we just go right into it. Let's have you turn to Legislative Exhibit 161. Dr. Johnson, I'll represent to you that this is a list of the files that were contained within the NC House J-25003 back.zip file referenced in Dr. Chen's report. Have you seen these files before?
Yes.
All right. Can you explain generally what these files are?
Yes. So we talk about redistricting plans, but a plan is not just one file on a computer. All of these files together make up a plan in Maptitude. So there's the map, there's bin files which have data in them, there's an index file which has the key of which census blocks go to which districts, and all those kinds of little elements stored in different pieces of files. And so all these files together make up one plan.
Now, Dr. Johnson, I noticed something looking at this list of files, and I'd like to direct your attention to the date modified field at the right-hand side of that figure. Do you see how the .map file, the .rdp file, and the .bmp file in this list of files all have a date of last modification of June 28, 2017 at, what is this, 12:04 p.m.? Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you see how the other files have a last modified date of June 25th, 2017?
Yes.
Dr. Johnson, I'd like you to now refer to Plaintiff's Exhibit 569. Now, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Chen testified about this exhibit, and as I understand it, appears in his rebuttal expert report. Plaintiffs represent that this is a screenshot of the plan settings screen in Maptitude. The plan settings screen in Maptitude for this particular file. Have you seen a screen like this before?
Yes, all the time.
And do you see how it says under date last modified, June 28th, 2017 at 12:04 p.m.?
Yes.
That's the same date and time as those three files we talked about.
Correct.
All right. And do you see where the date created is June 25th, 2017?
Yes.
Dr. Johnson, your experience working with Maptitude, can you draw any conclusions about what may have happened on June 28, 2017 to cause those last modified dates for those three files to be changed from one to the other?
Objection, Your Honor. None of this is in his report. And the nature of the question itself just makes clear it's entirely speculative.
So on pages or paragraphs 30 through 34 of the expert rebuttal report, Dr. Johnson goes through and gives his analysis of the differences between, the modified dates on Maptitude files that were created and what can cause those Maptitude files to, to change. And that's the testimony that we're simply trying to elicit from him. Plaintiffs proffered Dr. Chen's testimony. They went through this on direct with him. To the extent there's any further detail we're asking to get into, it's squarely from his direct testimony, and it's backstopped by those paragraphs in the rebuttal report.
If the testimony is simply generic of the nature that's in the rebuttal report, then of course we would have no objection. But questions about specific files, nothing mentioning this specific file anywhere in that report, and so that's the nature of our objection.
Mr. Lewis, either rephrase or you wish to.
I will let me.
To a specific file, or are you just asking generically?
We're using the specific file to motivate a larger concept, so maybe I'll just ask the larger concept. Void the objection. Thank you. Dr. Johnson, in Maptitude, anytime a Maptitude file is opened and closed, will Maptitude change the last modified date of the zip file that's contained within it, or the zip file that represents the plan?
Yes, Maptitude's a little unusual. There's no file save command like there would be in Word or Excel. You never go up and say, save my work. It saves every time you click something. And every time, if you were in Microsoft Word and you opened a file and closed it, it wouldn't resave because you didn't change anything, you didn't save it. Maptitude, every time you close the map, it creates a new .bak.zip backup file just because you closed it. And so what we see in the dates is the recording of the actual files that changed as saved by Windows. So if you see all the files changed, well then some change was made in the map. Blocks were assigned to different districts, colors were changed on the map, work was done on the map. If all you see changed is 2 or 3 files, that just means it was opened and then so they might have looked, the user might have looked at the data view because you can change that view without impacting anything, but nothing else was done. It was either opened and closed by mistake, open and closed just to look at, but no changes were made in the map unless you see dates change throughout that list of files.
And Dr. Hoffler, we've also heard testimony about the comment field that appears on that 569. And can you describe what the content of this comments field represents?
So in Maptitude, every time you make a copy of a map, as I mentioned earlier, it's a lot easier to start from an existing map than it is to start from blank. So every time you make a copy and start from that, Maptitude records in the summary fields screen what map was copied into what map. And so you can see the history of the evolution of a map going back from whenever the original kind of Adam and Eve map was created.
All right. So simply looking at so is it fair to say then that a .back.zip file that we've been talking about simply represents the last piece in what may have been a chain of evolution of a map?
Right, and it could just be a map that someone looked at. They may not have even worked on it at the time of that last zip file.
So is it possible then that we saw a testimony about formula fields and data contained in these particular map files And is it not entirely possible then that those formula fields and other data were simply copied over from one or more of those predecessor files that you see listed in the comments box?
Yes. When you first set up a map in Maptitude, you have a lot of data in there, and you can set what percentages you want Maptitude to create. And usually a user would do it in groups. So you take all of the total population categories, breakdowns that come in your census data, and you divide them by total population so that you know what percentage of total population was. Oh. So you would know what percentage of the total population is white, and so on through each of your data categories. So most of us that do this regularly can almost do it in our sleep, because you have to set those up every time you start a new map or you add new data in. And then they're a lot of work, so we usually don't take them out. Even if we're not using that data, we can change the data view. Things can be moved around from left to right so they're not on screen or they are on screen without going through all the trouble of removing data that may have been from an earlier map.
Okay. So simply by looking at the .back.zip file, just plaintiff's exhibit 569 is the example, since I know you looked at this particular one. Do you have are you able to tell just from looking at this file whether this file represents, when Dr. Hoffler would have created the map in question?
No, you'd have to do a study of all the maps along the chronology of backup files to see when the map was actually drawn versus when it was just opened and looked at.
And by looking at, and I'm just going to take a step back from this particular one. And in general, when you look at a .back.zip file, are you able to determine, well, let me ask this another way. When you open up one of those .back.zip files, will it show you what was on some of the, for example, the data view screen? I know we've talked about that in this case. Will it show what's on that screen as of the time that whoever was last working on that map had the map file open?
It only shows what's on the screen when you close it. When you go to, say, redistricting and plan close, it doesn't tell you anything about what was on the screen while you were actually working on the map.
So simply by looking at a .back.zip file months or years later, is it possible to tell what the map maker had on his or her screen while the map was being drawn?
No, it only captures that moment when you exit. It doesn't capture the time when you're drawing the map.
Now I'd like for you to turn to what we have marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 572. I think we can go through this one pretty quickly. This represent to you, Dr. Johnson, that Dr. Chen, testified about this exhibit, and that plaintiffs represented. It's a screenshot of that plan settings screen from Maptitude for the North Carolina J24 plan from June 24, 2017. Have you seen a screen like this before?
Yes.
Now I'll just ask, it appears that the difference between the date created and date last modified here was about 40 minutes. Dr. Johnson, your experience working with Maptitude, you do a lot of map making in 42 minutes?
Not on the scale of North Carolina.
Okay. And in order to assess when this particular Senate plan was drafted, would you need to review the 4 additional files under that comment box?
Yes, you'd want to go back through the earlier zip files of this J24 map and those earlier maps that it was copied from to see where the district borders were actually drawn for the final time. Safe to say it wasn't in this map in 42 minutes.
Lewis will go ahead and take a 15-minute recess and resume at 10 minutes till 4. Mr. Lewis, further questions?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Dr. Johnson, I would now like to direct your attention to another issue that came up during the direct examinations of Dr. Chen as well as Dr. Cooper. I'd like to display Plaintiff's Exhibit 153, which is Figure 30 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Dr. Johnson, I'll represent to you that this Dr. Chen has testified that this formula appeared in a number of the Hoffler map files that have been reviewed in this case. Are you familiar with this type of a formula in Maptitude?
Yes.
Okay. And have you worked, what do you recognize this formula to be?
Yes, it's pretty clearly a way of calculating an alternative version of what I use for my Republican Advantage score, where he's combining the Republican votes and Democratic votes in different elections to establish a measure of the partisanship of that territory.
And in your redistricting work, do you commonly work with these type of political index type formulas?
When we're working with jurisdictions that have partisan elections, a lot of what we do is nonpartisan, but certainly states and other jurisdictions that have partisan elections, we'd use this.
Now, does this particular formula contain any 2016 election results for the state of North Carolina?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I'm sorry, but none of this is in the rebuttal report. Dr. Chen discussed this formula in his rebuttal report. Dr. Johnson then submitted a rebuttal to that rebuttal report. Couldn't discuss any of this in there. It's not in there.
Your Honors, if I may be heard on the objection. First of all, I think to orient the court, plaintiffs have been sitting on what we've now come to call the Hoffler files for months before they were turned over to us. Dr. Johnson was given a very, very limited period of time to pull a report together. So we're already working behind the 8 ball. Second, he's offering testimony to rebut direct trial testimony from Dr. Chen, as well as I believe Dr. Cooper, but our focus is Dr. Chen. He is testifying about matters that are to directly rebut testimony and direct examination, and that are well within the scope of his expertise and knowledge. I will further point out the point that we're going to make is actually very limited as well. We believe that this is fairly within the scope of rebuttal of direct examination testimony, and to the extent that plaintiffs would like to cross-examine him, they're more than welcome to do so.
All right. So, Mr. Lewis, based on your representation of this fairly narrow point that you're making about this, we're going to overrule the objection without prejudicing the plaintiff's right to object to further testimony that may call on greater expertise. But I think we understand where this is going and are satisfied that the testimony should be allowed.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Johnson, do you see any 2016 election data or election results for the state of North Carolina included within this formula?
No.
Would it surprise you that if Dr. Hoffler was drawing districts in 2017 for future elections, that he would leverage a political index that did not include 2016 elections?
I'm sorry, entire objection. This is now not only beyond the report, but it's just totally speculative.
Overruled.
It would surprise me when drawing districts for a legislature. I can guarantee those legislators are going to want to see their most recent election data in that database. Whenever I've dealt with legislators, they wanted to see their election results in that index, so you'd get it in there.
All right. We can move on. I'd now like to turn to another claim made by Dr. Chen in this case, namely that the maps recovered from the storage devices from Dr. Hoffler that he references in his reports were largely the same as the enacted 2017 districts. Are you familiar with this claim?
Yes.
Okay. I'd now like to refer you to Plaintiff's Exhibit 123, which is the corrected response report of Dr. Chen of June 7, 2019. And specifically, I'd like to refer you to the last full paragraph at the bottom of page 2. And in this page 2, Dr. Chen has asserted that the house map of Dr. Hoffler that he references had already finished assigning 90.9% of North Carolina's census blocks, containing 88.2% of the state's population, into their final districts. Do you see where he makes that claim?
Yes.
Do you believe that to be a fair characterization of the similarity between the Dr. Hoffler house map and the final enacted 2017 house map?
No.
Dr. Chen also alleges in this paragraph that Dr. Hoffler's Senate map had already finished assigning, and I'm going to switch the numbers, just save time. I will represent to you that he acknowledged he had a little typo here, and the numbers were supposed to be reversed. He writes, and I quote, "Similarly, in a June 24, 2017 draft Senate map, Dr. Hoffler had already finished assigning, again, switching those numbers, 97.6% of North Carolina's census blocks, containing, again, switching the numbers, 95.6% of the state's population into their final districts." Do you see that?
Yes.
And do you agree that Dr. Chen has, do you believe that Dr. Chen has fairly characterized the similarity of the state's enacted Senate plan with the Hoffler draft that you reviewed?
No.
All right. Let me take a step back on this issue. Do you agree with the method that Dr. Chen employed to calculate the similarity between those House and Senate draft maps and the final enacted maps of the state of North Carolina?
No.
And what were the problems with the approach that Dr. Chen employed in your view?
He didn't follow what we typically call the similarity index, which comes from a paper by Katz and Cox that's been published that provides a formula for calculating the average percentage of population that is in the same district from one map to another. This is more of a brute force calculation.
And Dr. Johnson, is the Cox and Katz similarity index generally accepted in the political science literature as a methodology to compare the similarity between two districting plans?
Yes.
Let's start with the Senate map, Dr. Johnson. I'd like for you to please refer to what we have marked here as Johnson demonstrative 6. You can get that up on the screen. And I'll represent that this comes from, this is map 1 of your rebuttal report, which is LDTX 090. So let's start with the map. What is this map depicting?
This is showing the broad scope of the groupings rule in North Carolina. The dark black counties are all locked in by the county grouping rule. There's no mapmaker discretion at all in those counties. The exact lines are all dictated by the state law. The kind of gray counties, there's 4 of them, 1 in the west, 2 right next to Mecklenburg County, and 1 in the southeast. Those are the ones that are locked in because their districts were drawn in 2011 and unchanged in 2017. And then the only places where there's mapmaker discretion in the 2017 redistricting are the counties where you can see the colors of the different districts.
So is it fair to say then on the entire state, if there's a county that's not brightly colored on that map, the map maker cannot change any districtings within that county?
Correct.
And did you calculate the percentage population of the state of North Carolina that resides in a county that is subject to map maker discretion?
Yes.
And what was that percentage?
So in statewide, the county grouping rule locks in 54.5% of the state's population, and then the unchanged 2011 districts locks in another 8.8%. So just over 63%, or essentially 2 out of 3 residents of the state, are locked in and can't be moved in the 2017 redistricting. And that leaves only just over 1/3, 36.7% of the state where the line drawer can move the population.
And Dr. Johnson, applying the similarity index approach that you've described, did you calculate the percentage of the residents that could be moved, where there was that map maker discretion, that were moved between Dr. Hoffler's draft map and the final enacted map for the North Carolina State Senate?
Yes.
Okay. And what percentage was that?
So between the Hoffler map that Dr. Chen said essentially predetermined the adopted map and the actual adopted map, 19%, essentially 1 out of every 5 people that could be moved was moved. So 81% on average was the population of a district that was in the same place in the Hoffler map and the adopted map. Only 19% moved.
So in your view, is it fair to characterize the Hoffler map and the final enacted map is essentially the same map?
No, it's not fair.
And do you view 19% of the eligible population being moved as a significant portion of the state's population?
Definitely.
Now, with respect to sort of demonstrate this principle, did you also look at sample Senate plans submitted by Common Cause and the Covington plaintiffs in connection with that Covington litigation?
Yes.
And did you run the same similarity calculations between the Hoffler draft map and those other 2 maps?
Yes, and as you can see here, more people moved, so 41% and 44% versus 19%. But still, we're talking about moving just two out of 5 people essentially moved from the Hoffler map to Common Cause, or Hoffler to Covington, and 1 out of 5 moved between Hoffler and the enacted map. That's a lot of change in all the maps.
And did you also perform these calculations using Dr. Chen's methodology, notwithstanding your concerns with it?
Yes. So
And
if,
what did you conclude? I'm sorry.
So if we use Dr. Chen's approach, where he found that 95.7% of the population was in the same place in the Hoffler map and the enacted map, you'd also have to say that 89% of the population is in the same place in the Hoffler map and the Common Cause map, and 88% is in the same place in the Hoffler map and the Covington map, largely because, as we just talked about, a lot of the population is locked in. By law, they have to be in certain districts. And then there just isn't, there was change, obviously, between the other maps, but there's also change between the Hoffler map and the enacted map. There's a lot of people moving in all 3 of those cases.
Did you perform a similar analysis between Dr. Hoffler's alleged draft house map relied upon by Dr. Chen and the enacted 2017 North Carolina State House of Representative maps?
Yes.
I'd like for you now to turn to demonstrative, where am I at here? Demonstrative Johnson 7. And I'll represent that this comes from LDTX 090, which is map 2 from your rebuttal report, as amended, and I believe you amended these results based on your errata that we discussed at the beginning of your testimony. Is that correct?
Correct. The 2 Common Cause numbers are what changed.
Okay. And let's start, if you could orient the court to this map and what it depicts.
Yes, so the color scheme in the map is the same. The dark black counties are locked in by the county groupings and traversals rule. The gray counties are locked in because they're unchanged from 2011 to 2017. And since House districts are smaller, there's less county groupings lock in. And then the counties where the districts are brightly colored are the counties where there is discretion as to how to draw the lines.
I'd like to now focus on the percentage. I believe you calculated the percentage of North Carolina's population that's locked in, as you've described it, by the county grouping rules and the unchanged 2011 districts. Can you walk the court through those calculations?
Yes, so the groupings and traversals rule in this case locks in 22% of the population, and then the unchanged 2011 districts rule locks in 24.4% of the population. So just under half, 46.5% of the population is locked in, and then just over half is subject to map maker discretion in the House map.
Now, Dr. Johnson, applying your similarity index criteria, did you compare the Dr. Hoffler draft House map with the enacted 2017 House map?
Yes, and found that 36% of, on average, 36% of each district was moved between the Hoffler map and the enacted plan.
And Dr. Johnson, in your opinion, is a map that moves 36% of the state's eligible population the same, from one map to the other? Is it fair to characterize those 2 maps as the same?
No, you're moving a third of the population that can be moved between the 2 maps.
And similarly, to provide a basis for comparison, did you also perform that similarity index calculation with the Common Cause and Covington plaintiffs maps?
Yes, so we got about 70% of the population differed among the discretionary population between Hoffler and Common Cause, about 60% between Hoffler and the Covington map. So definitely more people, but in all these cases we're seeing lots of people moved between the map that supposedly is essentially identical. If a third or more of the population moves, I don't consider that essentially identical.
All right. And did you perform a similarity calculation using Dr. Chen's methodology?
Yes. Looking at the population that could be moved, we get about 75%, and the enacted plan stayed in the same spot. Less, but not that much less, in the Common Cause and Covington maps at 65.9 and 67.4.
Okay. I'd like for you now to turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 143, which is Figure 20 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. And Dr. Johnson, did you review this figure in connection with the preparation of your rebuttal report?
Yes.
And I thought this was maybe helpful to help illustrate your point. Can you explain how your analysis would help inform the information here that Dr. Chen's provided about these two districts?
Yes, so he's highlighting that 100% of District 31 and 97.94% of District 32 are in the same district in the map that's called the Hoffler map, and then the adopted map. What's not mentioned is that, of course, by the traversal rule, Davie County is locked. And so its population by law has to be in the same place in every map. It's not like Dr. Hoffler chose to assign it one place and then the enacted map chose to follow his recommendation. By law, in every map, Davie County has to be drawn intact. That's what the traversal rule says.
And I'd now like to have you turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit P130. Which I will represent to you is Figure 7 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Have you seen this particular figure before?
Yes.
And you responded to this in your rebuttal report, correct?
Yes.
All right. And is this an example of where Dr. Chen's methodology inflates the similarity between the Dr. Hoffler plan, alleged plan, and the enacted House plan?
Yes.
Can you explain how that is so?
And again, it's portraying the two maps as identical and highlighting that they're identical when they're identical because of the county traversal rule. You know, across the state, we had all those districts that I showed in the earlier map that are locked in by the traversal rule or by the keeping them identical to 2011. And so that's locking these seats in, not choices to keep Dr. Hoffler's lines in the new map.
Finally, Dr. Johnson, I see, okay. Finally, Dr. Johnson, I'd like to turn your attention I see. Just to clarify on this one particular exhibit, Dr. Johnson, were any of the districts in this particular grouping unchanged from 2011?
Off the top of my head, I'm not recalling, but I know it's in my report.
Please feel free to refer to your report if you need to refresh your recollection.
Correct. So on page 9 of my rebuttal report, I refer to the county traversal rule dictates that Duplin County be kept whole in one district, while districts 14 and 15 are locked in as unchanged from 2011. So all three of those districts are locked in.
Thank you very much. Finally, Dr. Johnson, I'd like to turn your attention to two demonstrative exhibits that were produced for the first time during Dr. Chen's redirect examination almost a week ago on Thursday morning. They were marked for identification as demonstratives D5 and D6. And I'd like for you to turn to what we have identified in here as Chen D5.
Okay?
I'll represent to you that this is a series of plans that Dr. Chen created as sort of to illustrate the difference between certain differences between HD 59 before and after being redrawn or as affected by the special master in Covington. Apologize for my slightly unclear question there. Have you seen this demonstrative before?
Yes.
All right. And are you familiar, Dr. Johnson, with the work of the special master in Covington and more specifically with the districts that the special master changed?
Yes, I was an expert witness in the remedy stage of Covington. I was an expert witness in the remedy stage of the Covington case.
All right. Dr. Johnson, I'd like for you to turn to the third page, and I apologize that they're unnumbered. It was the way they were produced to us. And this is the section of this plan that has the pink and the green. Do you see that?
Yes.
All right. Now, Dr. Johnson, I'll represent to you that Dr. Chen testified that the green area on this particular figure represents areas moved out of HD 59 by the special master, and that pink areas were moved into HD 59 by the special master. You see that?
Yes.
All right. Dr. Johnson, I'll further represent to you that Dr. Chen testified that, quote, with respect to this particular, the special master's change to HD 59, that, quote, the special master again made small adjustments to the boundaries in the northwest corner of House District 59. Dr. Johnson, did you have occasion to review the data that underlies this particular figure?
Your Honor, I'm going to object because I know where this is about to go. Last night, we received from legislative defendants what's marked in here as Johnson demonstrative D8. I think it's the very next tab. Your Honor will remember that when this discussion over these demonstratives came up on, I think it was Wednesday of last week, there was a lengthy discussion. And one of the specific things that legislative defendants asked the court is whether they could have their experts do an analysis of population density in these areas. I have the transcript sites here, Your Honor wants it. And Your Honor ruled specifically, no, they can't, because that's not something Dr. Chen did. The court ruled that only this was just a demonstrative of sort of where the pink, where the green are that the special master changed. And that, if they thought that he was getting the pink or the green wrong in illustrating the boundaries, then that's something that they could have an expert testify to. And the other thing I would note, Your Honor, is that, Dr. Johnson nothing in any of his reports or even mentions the special master or the special master's district. So even though these are labeled demonstratives, they're no way demonstrating or illustrating something that he would otherwise be allowed to testify about. But the most important point is, like I said, Your Honor ruled on this very specific issue, and yet the table in D8 is doing just what Your Honor said they can't do. And the site, Your Honor, is it was the 718 transcript, the AM transcript at pages 122 to 123.
I mean, my My recollection was, I mean, it's perhaps more cluttered, demonstrative than we really need for the point that I thought was being made. So, Mr. Lewis, my understanding of these demonstrative exhibits when they were introduced was simply to show where the special master had drawn lines that affected District 59 and where Dr. Chen had allowed lines to be redrawn. He froze, as I recall, a portion of the line, but manipulated other portions of the line of the same district. The notion being that part of the line of that district was dependent on the special master's map. Other lines of that same district were not dependent on the special master's map. That's my recollection of the gist of that testimony, and that these maps, although they show in great detail a lot of census blocks or BTDs, or I'm not even sure what they are, they were not being offered to show anything other than where the lines were that were moved and not moved. And so if you want to yield to Mr. Farr, who I see is standing to speak, I'll be happy to go from Mr. Farr.
Yes, Judge Whitworth, thank you very much. I think why this is important, Your Honor, is because the whole point of Dr. Chen's testimony was that these were just small little changes, and that meant that it wasn't a big deal that the plaintiffs in Dr. Chen's simulations modified the boundaries for this district. But that depends on how you define small little changes. And I recall, my memory is probably not as good as most people in this courtroom, and I may be wrong, but I thought I asked Dr. Chen about what he meant by small little changes. And I asked him, I believe, if he knew what the population was that was moved. And he said he didn't know. And that's why we asked for this information. Because to say that these are small little changes, and it's not a big deal for Dr. Chen to change the special master's district in his simulation, is not very accurate if the small little changes actually involve a whole bunch of people. So that's why we asked for the information we asked for, which we had not had access to before Dr. Chen testified. And that's why the line of questions that Mr. Lewis wants to ask ought to be allowed. Thank you.
Your Honor, we'll just be very brief. The court said, and I'm just quoting Your Honor, which I know is a dangerous thing to do, population densities and things of that sort, that's what the court said, are not something that the other side's expert can come up and testify about these maps. I don't know if this is a motion for reconsideration of that ruling or something, but that's exactly what this is. And the other thing I'll say is, you know, we got this last night for the first time. Haven't been able to, you know, confirm the numbers, run the analysis. But I think the most important thing, like I said, is the court's already ruled on this.
All right, objection sustained.
Your Honor, we would respectfully like to have this witness make a proffer of what his testimony, an offer of proof of what his testimony would have been, if that's acceptable to the court.
That's fine.
Thank you.
We'll accept an offer.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson, I'd like for you to just briefly turn to demonstrative 8. And would you please indicate, Dr. Johnson, did you calculate the population in House District 59 that was moved in and moved out of the district by the special master?
Yes.
And what did you calculate that percentage of the district population to be?
In House District 59's case, 8% of the population of the final district was added by the special master. I'm sorry, 8% of the original House District 59 was added by the special master into the new district. And 9%, just under 7,000 people were removed for a total of 13,524, or 17% of the district population has changed from the original to the post special master district.
And Dr. Johnson, did you perform a similar calculation for the percentage of Senate District 27 that was added or removed by the special master?
Yes, there the change was much bigger because we're right in the heart of the city, and essentially a quarter of the district was added by the special master, a quarter of the old district was removed, so that actually half, 49% of the district is new after being redrawn by the special master.
And on the basis of that percentage change, Dr. Johnson, would you agree with the representations to which Dr. Chen testified before this court that those were small changes to the boundaries of HD 59 and Senate District 27?
I would definitely disagree with that characterization. 17% and 49% of the district's population is far from a small change.
Okay. I think, Your Honors, I think that will conclude our proffer. We thank the court for allowing that.
Yes.
And one final point, and I think this is within the ambit of the court's ruling, specifically to have the witness talk about any errors that would be in D5 and D6. On Friday, July 19th, plaintiff's counsel presented an updated version of Chen demonstrative D5 and D6, and I will tell you that he represented to the court that the change affected only, quote, a speck of land. Dr. Johnson, did you happen to notice that error yourself when you were reviewing the original versions of D5 and D6 about which Dr. Chen testified on July 18, 2019?
Yes, actually, coincidentally, I had identified the areas and was running population numbers at the very time the email came in saying, whoops, we made a mistake. Well, you probably can't, I forget the exact wording, but essentially, you can't see this with your naked eye, but we'll tell you about it in the morning. And I had already spotted it and was running the numbers on it.
All right. And how many people were affected by the error that Dr. Chen had in his initial D5 and D6 demonstratives?
It was almost 7,000 people in total. As shown on the bottom of that demonstrative, it's 2,400 and change in the House map and over 4,000 in the Senate map.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We have no further questions.
Cross-examination.
Hello, Dr. Johnson. My name is Daniel Jacobson. I'm an attorney for the plaintiffs in this matter. Sorry. Hello, Dr. Johnson. My name is Daniel Jacobson. I'm an attorney for the plaintiffs in this matter.
Hello.
If we could pull up Legislative Defendants Exhibit 287. and go to page 3. Dr. Johnson, this is the opening report you submitted in this case, I believe.
Yes.
And you mentioned in your direct testimony, Dr. Johnson, that you've testified in cases before, is that right?
Yes.
And those cases are listed here on your expert report?
Yes, and in my resume.
And you mentioned in your direct testimony that you've never been excluded as a witness, is that right?
Yes.
And when you said you've never been excluded as a witness, you just meant based on your qualifications, right? Let me rephrase the question. You weren't describing whether the court substantively accepted, agreed with, or disagreed with your analysis, right?
Right. I was referring to whether or not I was accepted as an expert.
Right. And if we look at the paragraph, paragraph 7, you list the cases in which you've testified at trial, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
And there's 3 cases in which you've testified at trial as an expert witness. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, it doesn't mention the Covington. I also well, I guess I didn't list that because that was the remedy stage. Oh, sorry. It doesn't mention Covington because in that case I was
Sure.
in the remedy stage. But yes, I testified in all the ones listed there.
Right, so thank you. So you've testified in 3 cases at trial in front of a court as an expert witness and once at a hearing in the Covington case. Is that right?
I don't know the difference between trial and hearing, but
Okay.
I'll take your word for it.
4 times total, it's fair to say you've testified as an expert witness in a courtroom in front of a court. Is that right?
I believe so. I may be forgetting one, but that's...
Okay. The first of those cases listed here is the City of Palmdale case in California State Court. Is that right?
Yes.
And the court in that case rejected your analysis and found that your work in the case was, quote, unsuitable and, quote, troubling. Is that right?
No.
You're saying the court didn't say that about your work in the case?
Right. They said that about the map that was produced. They did not say that about my expert testimony.
But you created the map that they said that about, right?
At my client's direction.
Okay. So you concede the court said that the map that you created in that case was, quote, unsuitable and, quote, troubling. Is that right?
I don't remember the exact words, but something to that effect.
Can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 1032? If we go to the second page and look at the bottom 2 paragraphs. You recall the court said this, that the maps you created in that case were, quote, unsuitable and, quote, troubling. Is that right?
Like I said, I didn't recall the exact words, but that does appear to be the actual ruling.
Okay. The second case listed in your in which you testified at trial as an expert was the Garrett v. City of Highland case, also in California State Court.
Yes.
And the court in that case also rejected your analysis and said that it was, quote, inappropriate. Is that right?
I mean, I presume you're quoting exactly and probably have the quotes. I don't, of course, recall the exact wording from these rulings, but they did not go with my opinion on that.
If we could pull up, pardon me, Plaintiff's Exhibit 1036 and go to page 3, paragraph 9. And you can see there the court described your analysis in that case as, quote, inappropriate, right?
No, it described the mathematical adjustment for the Latino undercount in a California database is inappropriate, and ruled that we should go with the data even sich everyone acknowledged that it had an undercount in it.
But that was,
Even though they acknowledged that it had an undercount in it.
and that adjustment that was described as an inappropriate adjustment, that was an adjustment you made in the case, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, I should clarify that. It was the Census Bureau's calculated adjustment. So I made it not based on my opinion, but based on the Census Bureau's recommendation. judge decided that didn't, in the judge's opinion, that didn't apply in this case.
And the third case in which you testified was the Luna v. County of Kern case, is that right?
Yes.
And a federal court ruled in that case about a year or two ago. Does that sound right?
Yes.
And the court in that case also rejected your analysis and found that it, quote, lacks merit. Is that right?
I'll take your word for those exact words. They did disagree that on the question of whether a proposed remedy map was geographically compact or not.
You have no reason to dispute my representation that that's what the court said.
Correct.
Okay. And you mentioned this, but you also testified as a live expert witness at the remedial phase hearing in the Covington case here in North Carolina. Is that right?
Yes.
And you opined in that testimony that the special master who had been appointed had improperly used race as a predominant criteria and had purportedly sought to hit racial quotas. Is that right?
Yes.
And the Covington court rejected that analysis, right?
Yes.
And the court, in fact, said that your opinions were, quote, unreliable and, quote, not persuasive. Is that right?
I don't think that unreliable was about my opinions. I think that was relating to some of the numbers and data and those things that were involved in the case. But they did not go with my final conclusion.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 1033. And go to page 449 in the right-hand column. Well, I'm sorry, page 450. And zoom in there on the left-hand column, I should say. And there you can see the court says that it finds Dr. Johnson's analysis and opinion to be, quote, unreliable and not persuasive. Is that right?
Yes, that's what it says.
So, Dr. Johnson, you've testified as a live expert witness 4 times in total. And all 4 times the court's rejected your analysis. Is that right?
No.
In any of the 4 cases in which you've testified as an expert witness, has the court agreed with your analysis?
In part of the Palmdale case, yes. There were multiple parts of my testimony, and they only rejected the map that I drew at the client's direction. My opinions on polarized voting were accepted.
I'm sorry.
Oh, my opinions on polarized voting were accepted.
My opinion on-
Sorry. My opinions on polarized voting were accepted.
And in addition to those 4 cases, Dr. Johnson, you also submitted 2 expert reports on behalf of the legislative defendants to this court in the NAACP v. Lewis case about mid-decade redistricting. Is that right?
Yes.
And in those reports, you concluded that reverting the 4 Wake House districts at issue to their prior 2011 versions would improperly, and I'm just quoting from what you wrote, retain in place the impact, the quote ends there, of the 2011 districts that had been found to be racially gerrymandered in Wake County. Is that right?
Yes.
And this court didn't agree with that analysis, right?
Correct.
Okay. Starting with your opening reports, I guess, the opening report and the supplemental report, you concluded that the 2017 Senate map doesn't, quote, maximize Republican power. Is that right?
I think I pretty conclusively showed that it did not maximize it by drawing a more Republican map.
Right. And you did that by creating what you call a test map. Is that right?
One statewide test map and a number of smaller grouping specific test maps, yes.
And in drawing that test map, I just want to focus on your statewide analysis for now.
Okay.
In drawing your test map, you entirely ignored the county grouping rule, right?
Yes.
You also ignored traditional criteria like compactness and avoiding splitting municipalities and VTDs, right?
Yes.
And so the exercise you performed was to draw the most gerrymandered Senate map possible in favor of Republicans, ignoring all of those criteria, right?
Objection mischaracterizes the scope of his testimony in the report.
Overruled.
So I listed in the report the criteria that I was ignoring and when I drew the map.
But the purpose of that analysis was to draw what you considered to be the most favorable map for Republicans possible once ignoring those criteria. Is that right?
In terms of the measure I was looking at, yes, it's possible it could have gone even farther with a lot more time to really refine it, but yes.
Sure. Within the time you had, it was the best you could do for Republicans, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so because you found that your test map, ignoring all of those criteria, was more favorable to Republicans than the enacted Senate map, you concluded from your analysis that the partisan gain that Republicans achieved under the enacted plan was, quote, mitigated by these other criteria that you ignored, including the county groupings rule. Is that right?
Sounds fair, I think, if I'm understanding your
Okay.
description correctly.
Dr. Johnson, you understand that the county grouping rule comes from the North Carolina Constitution, right?
Yes.
And so I just want to be clear, statewide, you performed no analysis of the extent to which the enacted plans reflect the maximum Republican gerrymander within the confines of the county grouping rule, right?
I didn't do a statewide map, but I looked at pieces of it, the individual grouping tests. And of course, if you can improve it in one group, that would improve the statewide map.
If I'm recalling correctly, the only Senate county grouping for which you did any sort of individualized partisanship analysis within the confines of the county grouping rule was Mecklenburg County. Is that right?
Yes.
So for the rest of the state, you did no analysis of whether the existing Senate plan is the maximum Republican gerrymander within the county groupings. Is that right?
Right, having shown it in Mecklenburg, of course, even if the rest of the map stayed unchanged, the new map would be better for Republicans as a whole. If we can make an improvement in one spot, thanks to the county grouping rule, that doesn't weaken it anywhere else. So the ability to increase in Mecklenburg meant the statewide map could have been better.
Sure. So, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Sorry. Sorry. I'll slow myself down. Outside of Mecklenburg County, for every other Senate county grouping in the Senate map, you did no work or analysis to analyze whether operating within the county grouping rules, the current enacted plan is the most gerrymandered plan for Republicans that could exist.
Objection mischaracterizes the direct testimony, specifically used the word gerrymandering.
He can answer the question. Go ahead. It's overruled.
I would go back to the answer I gave you before of once it's shown at Mecklenburg, that meant statewide it could have been better for Republicans. I did not go on and do the additional analysis of each of the additional groups to see how much better it could have been improved beyond what I'd already done at Mecklenburg.
So if I picked any other individual county grouping in the Senate, I could name Wake Franklin, for instance. I could name all the other ones. You did no analysis of those Senate, that specific county grouping to see whether the enacted plan is the most favorable plan for Republicans within the confines of those county groupings.
Correct.
Okay. You mentioned this, you understand that the county grouping rule is a constitutional requirement, right?
Yes.
And you ignored that, but you did adhere to the constitutional requirement of equal population, right?
That's federal requirement, so yes.
Okay. You would agree that the equal population requirement really significantly limits a mapmaker's discretion to engage in partisan gerrymandering, right?
Sure.
And so, Dr. Johnson, you would agree that I could create a test map, we'll call it the Jacobson test map, that just ignores the equal population requirement and seeks to maximize Republican power without that constraint, right?
you as a citizen just doing it for fun?
Let's say I don't have your skills, but let's say I have some skills in Maptitude. I could create such a map, right?
I suppose so.
And you would agree that my Jacobson test map that ignores equal population constitutional requirement would be way more favorable to Republicans than your Johnson test map that just ignores the county grouping rule but complies with the equal population requirement, right?
If you did a competent job, I would assume it would turn out that way if that was your goal, but you'd
Well,
still be violating the federal constitution.
So here's what I would do, and you can tell me if I'm not doing it right. Let's say for my Jacobson test map for the Senate, I take each of the 49 most Republican VTDs in the state, and I put each of those, I create one district out of each of those VTDs. And then I put the remainder of the state in the 50th district, right? So I have 49 districts that are just one VTD that are super duper Republican VTDs, 50th district that is statewide. So Republicans are guaranteed to win at least 49 seats in my test map, right?
There are weird things that happen, but it's highly likely that they would
Okay.
win 49.
And so then if a third person were to do a comparison of the Jacobson test map and compared it to the Johnson test map and found that the Jacobson test map is way more favorable for Republicans than the Johnson test map, that wouldn't change the fact that your map is still super gerrymandered in favor of Republicans, right?
So it's a little weird because the whole focus of my report was looking at what North Carolina has done in terms of adopting restrictions on map drawing. Of course, North Carolina can't exempt itself from federal constitutional requirements, so it's a weird parallel for me to try to follow, but I'm trying.
Can North Carolina exempt itself from the county grouping rule?
It can change the constitution.
As currently constituted, can the legislature exempt itself from the county grouping rule? Under the present regime that we have, can the legislature exempt itself from the county grouping rule?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion.
I actually don't know the process for amending the North Carolina Constitution.
In your report, you created a map that you said was the most gerrymandered in favor of Republicans that you could get by when ignoring the county grouping rule, right?
Yes, within federal, it's implied, forgive me for not stating it, that I'd follow federal law since we have to.
Sure. And then what you did is you compared your Johnson test map to the enacted plan to draw some conclusions about the enacted plan. Is that right?
More to draw some conclusions about the effect of the county grouping rule, about that North Carolina's constitution puts in limits on the discretion of map drawers.
Right. So you're therefore not then drawing any conclusions about the extent to which, within the county grouping rules, this is the most favorable Republican plan that could exist, right?
That's the separate part of my report. You said we're only talking about the state
Sure.
map, test map.
And so if someone was to compare my Jacobson test map that's got the 49 districts that are just one VTD to your test map, it wouldn't make sense to draw conclusions about whether your test map, to say that your test map is not gerrymandered to favor Republicans just because I was able to draw an even more gerrymandered map ignoring constitutional requirements, right?
You could do a version of exactly what I did in my report by pointing out that your map demonstrates that the federal equal population and contiguity requirements put a significant limit on mapmaker discretion.
Right. So, but just to rephrase my question, it doesn't mean that your Johnson test map is not gerrymandered to favor Republicans, right?
Well, I often give talks and people always complain about maps being gerrymandered when we're working on projects. And at this point, the definition of gerrymander means any map that the speaker doesn't like. You know. there's no definition of gerrymander. It's just a map that the person doesn't like for whatever reason. It could be gerrymandered because it's not compact. It could be gerrymandered for partisan reasons. That's not a defined term.
All right, I'll drop the word gerrymander. Just by comparing my Jacobson test map to your Johnson test map, it wouldn't be fair to draw the conclusion that you did not draw your Johnson test map to favor Republicans as much as you could, just because I was able to draw even more favorable map for Republicans, right?
Well, you can't draw a map that doesn't comply with federal law. I mean, the state has no ability to change federal law.
And the General Assembly has no ability to get rid of the county groupings rule, right?
Again, there's some process to amend the North Carolina Constitution. I just don't know what it is.
Dr. Johnson, you only created a test map for the Senate, right? Not for the House?
Correct.
So you say in your report that you would find, quote, similar results for the House, but you don't actually present any analysis to prove that, right?
There simply wasn't time. I would have been happy to do it if we had more time.
Mr. Jacobson, it's 5 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and recess for the afternoon, resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
Superior Court's recess until tomorrow at 9 o'clock.